The massive space station called Chronos 7 floated in the darkness between stars and inside its largest arena. Thousands of beings from hundreds of different worlds gathered to watch the annual dart championship. The arena was enormous, with gleaming metal walls and holographic displays that showed betting odds and competitor information in dozens of languages. The air hummed with translator devices working overtime to convert the chatter of countless alien species into something comprehensible. Among the crowd of towering warriors and enhanced athletes stood one figure who seemed completely out of place. Margaret Sullivan was 52 years old, with gray streaks running through her brown hair that she kept tied back in a simple ponytail. She wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days, and her hands were rough and calloused from decades of farm work. She carried a small worn leather case that contained 3 ordinary steel-tipped darts and nothing else. Around her stood competitors who towered over her small frame, and many of them wore armor or carried cases filled with expensive high-tech throwing equipment that cost more than her entire farm back in Montana. The registration line moved slowly, and Margaret waited patiently while alien beings pushed past her and muttered comments in their various languages. A creature called a Vraxian, which stood nearly 8 feet tall with blue-green scales covering its body, leaned down to whisper to its companion. The translator chip converted the words into English for Margaret to hear. The Vraxian said that humans must be desperate to send an old woman to compete in such a serious tournament. The creature's companion laughed, and several other nearby competitors joined in the mockery. Margaret kept her eyes forward and her expression calm. She had grown up on a ranch in Montana and spent her whole life dealing with stubborn animals and harsh weather and difficult neighbors who underestimated her. This was nothing new. She had served in the army when she was young and learned to shoot straight and keep her composure under pressure. After her service ended, she returned home and married a man named Jake, and they ran a small cattle farm together for 25 years until he passed away from cancer. Now she ran the farm alone with help from her daughter Lisa and the local community. A human military officer stood near the entrance wearing a crisp blue uniform with gold insignia on the shoulders. His name was Paul Henderson, and he held the rank of commander in the Earth Defense Fleet. He had been assigned to escort the human representative to this tournament, though he privately thought the whole thing was a mistake. Every other species had sent professional athletes or enhanced warriors with cybernetic implants and genetic modifications. Earth had sent a farmer from Montana because she happened to win the preliminary rounds that were open to all citizens. Commander Henderson walked over to Margaret and spoke quietly so the aliens would not hear. He suggested that she did not have to go through with this and no one would think less of her if she withdrew from the competition. Margaret looked at him with patient eyes that reminded him of his own grandmother, and she said simply that she had signed up and intended to throw. Her voice was gentle but firm, and carried the tone of someone who did not make promises lightly. A massive warrior from a species called the Korgath pushed past Margaret and nearly knocked her to the ground. The creature was covered in thick gray skin and muscles that bulged beneath armor plating. His name tag identified him as Drakor the Undefeated, and he had won 17 major tournaments across the galaxy. He sneered down at Margaret and told her to move aside because this arena was for true competitors and not fragile creatures playing at sport. Margaret steadied herself and said nothing, but her grip on the dart case tightened slightly. The registration official was a being made of crystalline structures that refracted light in strange patterns. Its name was Zixthor, and it processed Margaret's registration with visible disdain, evident in the flickering colors that moved across its surface. The official told Margaret that medical facilities were available for when she inevitably injured herself, and assigned her to throwing platform number 47. Margaret thanked the official politely and made her way through the crowd toward her designated area. The betting screens that lined the arena walls displayed odds for every competitor, and Margaret's name appeared at the very bottom with odds of 10,000 to 1 against winning even a single match. Holographic displays showed highlights from previous tournaments featuring spectacular throws and dramatic victories by enhanced athletes who could calculate trajectories faster than computers or who possessed strength that could drive darts through solid metal. Margaret reached her platform and set down her case. The platform was a raised circular area about 6 feet in diameter, with sensors built into the floor to detect any technological cheating. She opened her case and looked at her 3 darts. They were simple and old-fashioned, with steel tips and plastic flights that she had owned for nearly 30 years. She had bought them at a sporting goods store in Kalispell when she and Jake first started playing darts at the local bar on Friday nights. Around her, the other competitors were warming up with elaborate throwing techniques and expensive equipment. A being with 4 arms practiced a complex spinning throw, while another competitor used a device that projected holographic target practice into the air. Margaret simply took out one dart and held it in her hand, feeling the familiar weight and balance. She had thrown these same darts thousands of times over the years and knew them better than she knew anything else in her life. The arena announcer's voice boomed through speakers in every language simultaneously. The opening round would begin in 10 minutes, and all competitors should take their positions. Margaret rolled her shoulders to loosen the muscles and thought about her daughter Lisa back home, taking care of the cattle and the crops. She thought about the old barn where she had mounted a dartboard decades ago, and spent countless evenings throwing darts while the sun set over the mountains. She thought about Jake teaching her to breathe slowly and release smoothly, and let the dart fly naturally without forcing it. The crowd settled into their seats and the noise level dropped as the tournament prepared to begin. Margaret stood calmly on her platform and waited for her name to be called. The tournament format was straightforward and brutal in its simplicity. Each competitor would throw 3 darts at targets that became progressively more difficult with each round. After every round, the bottom half of all competitors would be eliminated until only one champion remained. The current defending champion was a creature called a Meridian named Velshara, whose species possessed eyes that could see in 17 different light spectrums and perceive depth and distance with accuracy that exceeded the best human technology. Margaret's first opponent was a young member of the Threxian species named Kaxlar, who stood about 6 feet tall with smooth purple skin and 4 arms that gave him distinct advantages in balance and throwing technique. The crowd settled into their seats, and many of them were clearly expecting this match to be over within seconds. Some aliens had even started placing bets on how badly the human would lose, rather than whether she would lose at all. A human military officer named Karen Price sat in the observation section reserved for the Earth delegation. She wore a lieutenant's uniform and had been assigned to document the tournament for military records. She leaned toward Commander Henderson and asked quietly why Earth had not sent someone from the Olympics, or at least a professional athlete, instead of a farmer from Montana. Commander Henderson shrugged uncomfortably and explained that the preliminary rounds had been open to all citizens, and Margaret had won every match fair and square against some very good competitors. On the arena floor below them, the holographic display materialized to show the first target, which was a standard dartboard with a familiar arrangement of numbered sections and scoring zones. The board hung in the air about 20 feet away from the throwing platforms, which was the regulation distance used across the galaxy. Kaxlar stepped up to his platform first, and the crowd grew quiet to watch his technique. The Threxian moved all 4 of his arms in a complex coordinated pattern that involved shifting his weight and rotating his torso, while 3 of his hands adjusted his balance, and the 4th hand held the dart. The movement was beautiful in its precision, and when he released the dart, it flew straight and true into the triple 20 scoring zone. He repeated the throw 2 more times, and all 3 darts clustered together in the highest value area of the board. The crowd erupted in approving roars and clicks and chirps from dozens of different species. Margaret stepped onto her platform, and the jeering began immediately. A voice called out from the Vraxian section, suggesting that perhaps they should move this competition to a children's league, and cruel laughter followed the comment. Other voices joined in with similar mockery, but Margaret did not react to any of it. She simply opened her case and removed a single dart, and took her position on the throwing line. The arena floor was made of some kind of smooth composite material that felt different under her boots compared to the wooden planks of the county fair back home in Montana. But the distance to the target was exactly the same as it had always been. 20 feet and 7 3/4 inches. She had measured that distance so many times over the years that her body knew it instinctively, without needing to think about it consciously. Margaret thought about her small farm on the edge of Flathead Valley, where the mountains rose up against the sky, and the wind swept down through the valleys carrying the smell of pine trees and grass. She thought about the barn where she had mounted an old dartboard on the wall decades ago, after Jake brought it home from town. Those evening practice sessions had started as just a way to pass the time, but after Jake died, they became something more important. They became meditation and therapy and a way to quiet the noise in her head after long days of physical labor. She drew her arm back using the technique that had not changed in hundreds of years of human dart throwing. Elbow up and level with the shoulder. Sight down your arm to the target. Smooth acceleration and clean release at the right moment. Let the dart fly naturally without trying to steer it or force it. Her grandfather had taught her father to shoot, and her father had taught her, and the principles were the same whether you were throwing darts or shooting rifles or tossing hay bales. The dart flew through the air in a smooth arc and struck the very center of the board in the bullseye, the small red circle at the heart of the target. The arena fell completely silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then confused murmuring began to spread through the crowd. Surely that was just a lucky throw. Humans were known for occasional fortunate accidents. Margaret picked up her second dart without any change in her expression. Same stance and same motion and same calm breathing. The dart left her hand and flew true. Bullseye again. The murmuring grew louder and took on a different tone. Kixler's 4 eyes narrowed as he watched from his platform. This was no longer looking like luck. Margaret picked up her third and final dart. She went through the same routine one more time. Draw back and sight and release. The dart struck the bullseye right next to the first 2. Commander Henderson leaned forward in his seat and said quietly that this was impossible. Lieutenant Price pulled up statistics on her datapad showing that 3 consecutive bullseyes at tournament-level competition was extremely rare, even among enhanced species with cybernetic aiming systems. For an unaugmented human to do it on her first attempt in a galactic tournament was unheard of. The judges at the official table activated their scanning equipment to check for any technological assistance or hidden enhancements. Sophisticated sensors swept over Margaret's body looking for implants or performance-enhancing drugs or any kind of artificial aid. The scans came back completely negative. No implants of any kind, no hidden technology, no chemical enhancements. Just a 52-year-old human woman with 3 old-fashioned steel-tipped darts. Zix Thor, the crystalline official, announced the results in a voice that sounded uncertain for the first time. Margaret Sullivan had scored maximum points and advanced to the next round. Kixler had also scored well but not enough to overcome 3 perfect throws. The young Threxian bowed respectfully to Margaret as he left the platform and told her that she had earned his respect. The betting screens began updating rapidly as algorithms tried to recalculate odds based on this new information. Margaret's odds shifted from 10,000 to 1 down to 500 to 1 within seconds. Galactic news feeds picked up the story and began broadcasting updates. An unknown human competitor had just defeated a favored Threxian athlete using nothing but basic equipment and old-fashioned technique. Margaret packed her darts back into their case and waited calmly for her next match to be announced. By the time the second round began, the atmosphere in the arena had changed significantly. Word of Margaret's perfect first round had spread through the crowd, and many aliens who had been openly mocking her earlier were now watching with genuine curiosity. The betting screen showed her odds continuing to improve as more spectators placed wagers on the possibility that this human might actually be a serious competitor. Her odds had dropped from 500 to 1 down to 100 to 1 in just the short break between rounds. Margaret's second opponent was a member of the Korgath warrior species named Greshka, who stood nearly 9 feet tall with thick gray skin covered in battle scars. Greshka had cybernetically enhanced eyes that could calculate distances and trajectories, faster than most computers, and his throwing arm had been strengthened with military-grade implants that allowed him to drive darts through solid metal plates. He had competed in this tournament for 7 years and never placed lower than the top 10. The target for the second round was significantly more challenging than the simple stationary dartboard from round 1. Instead of a fixed target, the holographic system projected moving circles that appeared and disappeared at random intervals across a wider area. Competitors had 5 seconds to identify a target and make their throw before it vanished and a new target appeared somewhere else. The scoring was based on how many targets were hit out of the total number that appeared during each competitor's turn. Greshka stepped up to his platform first, and his enhanced eyes began tracking the holographic projections the moment they started appearing. His movements were precise and powerful as he threw 3 darts in rapid succession. Each throw was accompanied by a sound like a small explosion as the dart left his hand with tremendous force. He managed to hit 3 out of 5 targets that appeared during his turn, and the crowd roared its approval. It was a solid performance that would be difficult for most competitors to match. Margaret took her position, and this time the jeering was much quieter and more uncertain. She held her first dart loosely in her hand and watched the holographic targets begin their cycling pattern. She did not try to calculate anything or think about trajectories. Instead, she just watched and waited while her mind fell into that quiet space where conscious thought stopped interfering with unconscious competence. Growing up on the ranch in Montana, she had learned to shoot skeet with her father on Sunday afternoons. They would set up the manual launcher in the back pasture and take turns calling for pulls. The clay pigeons would arc across the sky, and you had to track them smoothly and lead your shot just the right amount to intercept their flight path. Her father always said that thinking too much would make you miss. You had to let your body do what it already knew how to do. A target appeared to her left, and Margaret's arm moved smoothly through the throwing motion. The dart sailed through the air and passed through the holographic ring just as it fully materialized. Perfect hit. A second target appeared high and to the right. She adjusted her angle and released. Another hit. The third target was farther away and moving faster, but her throw compensated automatically. 3 hits out of 3 attempts. The arena erupted in shocked exclamations, and the noise level jumped dramatically. Aliens were chattering to each other in dozens of languages, and the translator systems were working overtime. Velshara, the reigning Meridian champion, leaned forward in the special competitors box, where the top-ranked athletes waited between matches. Her multifaceted eyes focused intently on the human woman, standing calmly on the platform below. Zixthor at the judges' table was frantically ordering new scans to be run on Margaret. The crystalline official could not believe that an unenhanced human was performing at this level. The scanning equipment swept over her again, looking for any possible explanation. The results came back exactly the same as before. No implants and no hidden technology and no performance enhancers of any kind. Just a middle-aged human woman with 3 old-fashioned darts and decades of practice. In the human section of the stands, Lieutenant Price was pulling up more information on her datapad. She read through Margaret's file again, looking for anything they might have missed. Commander Henderson watched over her shoulder as she scrolled through the data. Price pointed to a section of the file that showed Margaret's military service record. She had served in the Army during the First Iraq War and earned sharpshooter qualification with both rifle and pistol. After her discharge, she returned to Montana and went back to farming. Henderson read the details more carefully. Margaret had grown up hunting and shooting on her family's ranch. She joined the Army at age 19 and served for 6 years, including 1 combat deployment. Her shooting scores were in the top 5% of her entire training battalion. After leaving the military, she married Jake Sullivan, and they bought a small cattle farm where they raised their daughter Lisa. The file also noted that Margaret had won the county dart championship 15 consecutive years and held the record at her local bar for most bullseyes in a single evening. Price looked up at Henderson and said that Earth had not sent just a farmer to this tournament. They had sent a trained soldier who had been practicing precision targeting in one form or another for more than 30 years. Henderson nodded slowly and replied that everyone had made assumptions based on appearance. The aliens saw a middle-aged woman in casual clothes and assumed she was weak. But Margaret Sullivan had spent her entire life developing the exact skills needed for this competition. On the arena floor below, Margaret was preparing for the next round. Her opponent, Greshka, approached her before leaving and spoke through his translator device. He said that he had underestimated her and that was his mistake. She had fought with honor and skill. Margaret thanked him politely and said that he had thrown well and it was a close match. Greshka laughed and said it was not close at all and then departed with respect, showing in his bearing. The third round was announced, and Margaret would face a Vraxian named Thexnar, who was known for strategic brilliance and mathematical precision. The Vraxians were one of the most intelligent species in the galaxy, and could perform complex calculations in their heads faster than most computers. Thexnar had won this tournament twice before, and was considered one of the favorites to win again this year. The crowd was now completely focused on Margaret's performance. The news of her victories had spread beyond the arena, and millions of beings across the galaxy were tuning in to watch this unexpected development. The betting odds continued to shift dramatically. She was now listed at 20-1, which meant that serious gamblers were starting to believe she might actually have a chance of winning the entire tournament. Margaret sat quietly on a bench near her platform while the arena prepared for the next round. She took a drink of water from a simple plastic bottle and thought about home. Lisa would be finishing the evening feeding by now, and checking on the pregnant cow in the south pasture. The hay would need to be moved before the weather turned, and there were fence posts that needed replacing along the eastern boundary. Life went on back home regardless of what happened here in this arena floating in space. A young human reporter managed to slip past security and approached Margaret with a recording device. The reporter asked breathlessly how it felt to be representing all of humanity in this historic moment. Margaret looked at the reporter with patient eyes and said that she was just here to throw darts same as everyone else. The reporter pressed for more details, but security arrived and escorted them away before Margaret had to answer any more questions. Commander Henderson came down from the observation section to check on her. He asked if she needed anything or if there was anything the Earth delegation could provide. Margaret smiled and said she was fine, but thanked him for asking. Henderson hesitated and then said that she had already exceeded everyone's expectations and made Earth proud. Margaret replied that the tournament was not over yet. The third round began with an atmosphere of intense anticipation that Margaret had never experienced before in any competition. The arena was packed beyond its normal capacity, with beings standing in aisles and crowding against railings to get a better view. Additional holographic projection screens had been installed throughout the station, so that those who could not fit in the arena could still watch the matches. The noise level was almost overwhelming as thousands of aliens discussed and debated the human competitor who had emerged from nowhere. Thexanar the Vraxian stood nearly 7 feet tall with blue-green scales that reflected the arena lights. His large eyes were positioned on the sides of his head, giving him an extremely wide field of vision, and his 3-fingered hands were known for their precise motor control. He had studied recordings of Earth's preliminary matches before coming to this tournament, and believed he understood human limitations. Vraxians were convinced that intelligence and calculation would always defeat raw instinct. Before their match began, Thexanar approached Margaret on the arena floor. He spoke through his translator device in a voice that sounded like wind chimes. He told her that her species tired quickly due to inferior stamina, and that her body would fail her now that the competition had reached serious levels. Margaret listened politely and did not respond to the provocation. She had heard similar comments many times before from people who underestimated her. The target for this round was the most complex challenge yet. A 3-dimensional holographic sphere appeared in the space where the dartboard had been, and the sphere rotated in multiple directions simultaneously. Target zones appeared on different parts of the sphere's surface, and each zone had a different point value. Competitors had to calculate trajectory and timing and rotation speed all at once to determine where to aim their throws. The mathematics involved were extremely difficult even for species with enhanced cognitive abilities. Thexanar took his position first, and his eyes tracked the rotating sphere carefully. He stood completely still for almost a full minute, while his brain performed thousands of calculations per second. He was determining the optimal throwing angles and release times to maximize his score. When he finally threw his first dart, it flew in a curving path that intercepted one of the high-value zones exactly as it rotated into position. He repeated this process for his second and third throws, and each one took nearly a minute of calculation before execution. His total score was extremely high, and the crowd cheered his mathematical precision. Margaret stepped up to her platform, and this time there was very little mocking. Most of the crowd had realized by now that she was not just lucky. She held her first dart and watched the rotating sphere without trying to calculate anything consciously. Her mind did not work through equations or compute trajectories. Instead, she simply observed the pattern and let her body find the rhythm. The first dart left her hand within seconds of her taking position. No long calculation period and no visible hesitation. The dart flew straight and true and struck a high-value zone just as it came into alignment. The crowd gasped. The second dart followed just as quickly with the same result. The third dart completed a perfect round, and her score was actually slightly higher than Thexanar's despite her throws taking a fraction of the time. A Meridian mathematician in the stand stood up and announced loudly that the human was not calculating at all. She was operating on pure instinct and muscle memory. The mathematician explained that humans could achieve what they called a flow state where conscious thought was bypassed entirely, and the body performed complex actions based on ingrained patterns developed through thousands of hours of practice. The mathematician said this was actually more efficient than calculation for certain types of tasks. Velshara spoke for the first time since the tournament began. Her voice carried across the competitors' box where the remaining top athletes waited. She said that she had read about this aspect of human capability in the xenopsychology reports. Humans called it unconscious competence, and it was the highest level of skill mastery. The human's body knew the throwing motion so intimately that conscious thought would only interfere and slow down the process. Drakor the Undefeated, who was the massive Korgath warrior that had pushed past Margaret during registration, now watched her with something approaching respect. He said quietly to the other competitors near him that perhaps this human was a warrior after all. Just not the kind of warrior that their species were accustomed to recognizing. She was a warrior of patience and dedication rather than strength and aggression. The fourth round was announced, and Margaret found herself matched against a being from a species called the Zinthari, who possessed 6 arms and could throw multiple darts simultaneously. The Zinthari competitor named Velkris had been favored to reach the finals based on sheer throwing volume and speed. The target for this round was a series of smaller dartboards arranged in a circle, and competitors had to hit as many different boards as possible within a time limit. Velkris went first and demonstrated why the Zinthari were considered masters of multitasking. Using all 6 arms in coordination, the alien threw darts at multiple targets at the same time. The speed and precision were remarkable, and Velkris managed to hit 12 different targets in the allotted time period. The crowd roared approval, and the betting screens showed this was likely the end of the human's surprising run. Margaret took her position and looked at the circle of small dartboards. She only had 2 arms and could only throw 1 dart at a time. She could not match the Zinthari's speed through multitasking, but she did not need to. She began throwing with smooth rhythm that never varied. Each dart flew as soon as she was ready, and there was no wasted motion between throws. Pick up dart and throw, and pick up the next dart and throw again. Her movements were efficient in a way that came from decades of repetition. When time expired, Margaret had hit 13 targets, 1 more than Velkris despite having 4 fewer arms to work with. The efficiency of her motion and the speed that came from perfect muscle memory had been enough to overcome the physiological advantage. Velkris bowed deeply to Margaret and said through the translator that she had learned humility today. By the time the quarterfinals arrived, Margaret had become the most talked-about competitor in the entire history of the Galactic Games. News feeds across hundreds of worlds were broadcasting updates about the human farmer from Montana who was defeating enhanced aliens with nothing but practice and dedication. Philosophers and scientists were debating what this meant for the nature of skill and enhancement. Sports analysts were breaking down her technique frame by frame, trying to understand how she achieved such consistency. Margaret's quarterfinal opponent was a being called a Photari, who could perceive time slightly slower than other species, which gave them extra milliseconds to adjust their throws, mid-flight using tiny wrist movements. The Photari named Zerath was known for making impossible shots that seemed to curve around obstacles. The target for this round included holographic barriers that blocked straight-line paths to the scoring zones. Zerath's throws were beautiful to watch as the darts seemed to snake through the air around obstacles. The Photari's time perception allowed for adjustments that other species could not make. The performance was technically perfect and scored maximum points. The crowd believed there was no way the human could match this level of difficulty. Margaret studied the barriers for a moment and then began throwing. Her darts did not curve around the obstacles because she could not adjust them mid-flight. Instead, she threw at angles that used the edges of the barriers to deflect the darts into the scoring zones. Bank shots that relied on understanding geometry and physics. Her father had taught her to shoot pool in the local bar when she was young, and the principle was the same. Sometimes you could not make a straight shot, so you used the rails. She scored maximum points using a completely different technique than her opponent. The crowd went absolutely silent and then erupted in the loudest cheering yet. Margaret had just proven that there were multiple paths to the same destination, and that limitation could be overcome through creativity. Commander Henderson was now taking calls from admirals and politicians back on Earth who wanted updates. Lieutenant Price was being interviewed by galactic media outlets who wanted to understand how an unenhanced human was performing at this level. The entire human delegation was being overwhelmed with attention. But down on the arena floor, Margaret just packed her darts away and waited quietly for the semifinal match to be announced. The semifinals represented a level of competition that few beings ever reached in their entire lives. Only 4 competitors remained out of the hundreds who had started the tournament, and each one was considered a master of their craft. Margaret found herself matched against Drakor the Undefeated, who was the massive Korgath warrior that had dismissed her so rudely during registration. The irony was not lost on anyone watching. Drakkar approached Margaret before their match with a very different attitude than he had shown at the beginning of the tournament. He told her formally that he apologized for his earlier disrespect, and that she had earned his genuine respect through her skill. He said that she was clearly a true warrior, even if she did not fit the traditional definition that his people used. Margaret accepted the apology gracefully and told him that she understood he had made assumptions, just as she had been underestimated many times before in her life. The challenge for the semifinal round was distance. Instead of the standard 20 feet that dart competitions used for centuries, the target was placed at 50 feet away, which more than doubled the difficulty. Additionally, the arena's environmental controls activated wind generators that created unpredictable air currents across the throwing area. Competitors would have to account for both the extended range and the constantly shifting wind patterns. Drakkar's throws were demonstrations of raw power. His enhanced strength allowed him to drive the darts through the artificial wind with enough force that the air currents barely affected their flight. 2 of his 3 throws hit high-value zones despite the challenging conditions. His third throw was caught by a particularly strong gust and blown slightly off course into a lower scoring area. Still, his total score was impressive and would be difficult for most competitors to match. Margaret stood on her platform and felt the wind patterns moving across her face and arms. She had spent her entire life on a ranch in Montana, where the wind was a constant presence. She understood how air moved across open fields and how it swirled around barn structures and fence lines. She had learned to shoot rifles in crosswinds and compensate for bullet drift across distances. Reading wind was not something she had to think about consciously anymore. Then she had to think about breathing. Her first throw looked wrong the moment it left her hand. The dart arced wide to the left and several aliens in the crowd made disappointed sounds. But Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. The wind caught the dart precisely as she had anticipated and pushed it back to the right in a curving path that ended in the bullseye. The crowd erupted in astonished exclamations. Her second throw appeared to go high and looked like it would sail over the target completely, but a downdraft caught it and brought it down into the high-value zone at the last moment. The third throw seemed to fight against a crosswind before the air current shifted and guided it home. All 3 darts scored maximum points. Drakkar stared in disbelief at the target. He asked Margaret how she had predicted all of those wind shifts with such accuracy. Margaret smiled gently and told him that she had been reading wind for longer than he had been alive. She explained that wind was not random, if you understood the patterns and paid attention to the signs. Growing up on a ranch taught you to watch how grass moved and how dust swirled and how trees bent. All of those observations became instinct over time. The Korgath warrior laughed and said that he had learned an important lesson today. Strength and power were valuable, but understanding and patience were equally important. He bowed formally to Margaret with genuine respect and left the platform. The crowd gave him a standing ovation for his graceful acceptance of defeat. The final match was announced and the arena erupted in noise that shook the walls. Margaret would face Velshara, the reigning champion, and one of the most decorated athletes in galactic history. The Meridian had won this tournament 5 times and held records in 7 different throwing sports. Her species possessed visual capabilities that exceeded anything humans could achieve naturally, and she had trained for this competition her entire life. The tournament officials announced that the final match would be held the following day, to give both competitors time to rest. This was standard procedure for major galactic competitions, and Margaret was grateful for the break. She had been throwing for hours, and even though her technique was efficient, her body was starting to feel the strain. Commander Henderson and Lieutenant Price escorted Margaret back to her quarters through crowds of reporters and spectators who wanted to see the famous human competitor. Aliens pressed forward trying to ask questions or simply touch her, as if some of her skill might transfer through contact. Security personnel had to form a protective barrier to get her through the corridors safely. In her modest quarters aboard the station, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and took off her boots. Her feet were sore and her shoulder ached from the repetitive throwing motion. She was not young anymore and her body reminded her of that fact. She opened a communication channel to call home, and after a moment the video screen showed her daughter Lisa standing in the kitchen of their farmhouse. Lisa's face lit up with excitement when she saw her mother. She said that Margaret was all over the news and that the whole town was going crazy with celebration. People were gathering at the local bar to watch the final match tomorrow. and the mayor had declared it an unofficial holiday. Lisa said that reporters had been calling the farm constantly, and neighbors kept stopping by with congratulations. Margaret asked about the cattle, and Lisa laughed at the question. She said seriously that her mother was in the finals of the Galactic Games and she was asking about cattle. Margaret replied that someone had to worry about the practical things and that life went on regardless of what happened in tournaments. Lisa assured her that everything was handled, and that their neighbor Frank and several other people from town were helping with all the farm work. They talked for a while about normal things, the weather back home and how the crops were doing and whether the pregnant cow had given birth yet. Margaret felt herself relaxing as they discussed familiar topics. This was her real life, and the tournament was just a temporary interruption. After they disconnected, Margaret lay back on the bed and closed her eyes. There was a knock at the door, and Margaret opened it to find Commander Henderson and Lieutenant Price standing outside. Henderson said they needed to talk about tomorrow's match. He explained that Velshara was the most formidable opponent Margaret would face, and that the Meridian's capabilities were extraordinary. Her visual system could perceive depth and distance with precision that exceeded the best human instruments. Margaret invited them in and listened patiently, while Henderson described everything they knew about Velshara's abilities and techniques. The Meridian could see in spectrums that humans could not perceive and could detect tiny variations in air density that affected dart flight. She had trained with the best coaches in the galaxy and had access to practice facilities that used advanced simulation technology. Lieutenant Price added that Margaret had already exceeded everyone's expectations by reaching the finals. She had brought honor to Earth and humanity. No one would blame her if she decided that simply reaching this point was enough. Price said this carefully, as if trying not to offend, but also trying to give Margaret an out if she wanted it. Margaret looked at both officers with those patient eyes that had seen so much in her 52 years. She thanked them for their concern and told them she appreciated that they were trying to help. But she said firmly that she had come here to compete, and that was what she intended to do. Win or lose, she would throw her best and see what happened. She had never walked away from a challenge in her life, and she was not going to start now. Henderson nodded slowly and said he understood. He asked if there was anything Margaret needed or anything they could provide. Margaret thought for a moment and then asked if it would be possible to get a decent cup of coffee in the morning. Real coffee, not the synthetic stuff that most of the station served. Henderson smiled and promised to make it happen. After they left, Margaret prepared for bed and lay in the darkness thinking about tomorrow. She was not nervous exactly, but she felt the weight of expectation from millions of humans watching back on Earth. She thought about Jake and wished he could be here to see this. He would have found the whole situation amusing and would have told her to just throw like she always did and not worry about anything else. Margaret fell asleep thinking about the barn back home and the old dartboard on the wall, and countless Friday evenings spent throwing darts while the sun set over the mountains. The morning of the final match arrived with Margaret waking early as she always did from decades of farm life. The artificial lighting in her quarters was set to simulate Earth's day-night cycle, but her body did not need an alarm. She had spent too many years rising before dawn to feed cattle and check on animals to sleep late, even when she had the opportunity. She performed her normal morning routine and found that Commander Henderson had indeed delivered real coffee from Earth, along with a simple breakfast. The arena would not open for several more hours, but Margaret could already hear the noise of crowds gathering outside. Beings from across the galaxy had traveled to Chrono 7 specifically to witness this final match. The station's population had tripled overnight as ships arrived carrying spectators who wanted to see history being made. News broadcasts were calling it the most anticipated sporting event in galactic history. Margaret ate her breakfast slowly and drank her coffee while looking out the window at the stars beyond the station. She thought about how strange it was to be here in space participating in an alien tournament, when just a few months ago she had been worried about whether she could afford new fencing for the south pasture. Life took unexpected turns sometimes, and all you could do was deal with what came. Commander Henderson arrived to escort her to the arena, and he brought news that Earth's government had declared the day a global holiday. Billions of humans would be watching the match, and public viewing events were being held in every major city. The president had sent a personal message wishing Margaret luck and saying that regardless of the outcome she had already made humanity proud. Henderson showed her images of crowds gathering in Times Square and Trafalgar Square and public plazas across every continent. Margaret looked at the images and felt the weight of all those expectations. She told Henderson quietly that she hoped she would not disappoint everyone. The commander put his hand on her shoulder and said that she had already done the impossible by reaching this point. He said that millions of young people on Earth were inspired by her story, and that mattered more than winning or losing one match. Margaret nodded, but she still felt the pressure of representing her entire species. The walk to the arena took longer than expected, because the corridors were packed with aliens who wanted to see the human competitor. Security had to clear a path through the crowds, and beings reached out trying to touch Margaret as she passed. Some of them offered words of encouragement in dozens of different languages, while others simply watched in silence. Margaret kept her eyes forward and tried to ignore the overwhelming attention. When she entered the arena itself, the noise was deafening. The massive space was filled beyond any safe capacity, with beings packed into every available spot. Additional viewing platforms had been constructed overnight, and holographic screens filled the air, showing close-up views of the competitors. The betting screen showed odds that were nearly even between Margaret and Velshara, which meant that half the galaxy now believed the human had a genuine chance to win. Velshara was already waiting near the center platform. The Meridian stood about 6 feet tall with an elegant form that seemed to shimmer in the arena lights. Her skin had an iridescent quality that shifted through subtle colors, and her large eyes were positioned to give her exceptional depth perception. She wore a simple athletic suit that allowed free movement, and carried her darts in a case that looked ancient and well-maintained. The two competitors met at the center of the arena floor for the traditional pre-match greeting. Velshara spoke first through the translator system, and her voice had a musical quality. She told Margaret that she had earned respect through skill and dedication. She said that regardless of what happened in this match, Margaret had shown the galaxy that humans belonged among the competitive species. It was gracious and genuine. Margaret thanked her and said that Velshara was a worthy champion, and that it was an honor to compete against someone of her caliber. She said that she would do her best and hoped they would both throw well. Velshara replied that she would not hold back because that would be a greater insult than any mockery. She said that true respect meant giving maximum effort. Margaret agreed completely. The tournament official Zixthor announced the rules for the final match. Each competitor would throw 5 darts instead of the usual 3. The target would combine elements from all the previous rounds, including moving targets and distance and wind and obstacles. It would be the most difficult challenge that either competitor had ever faced. The scoring would be cumulative, with the highest total points determining the champion. The crowd settled into expectant silence as the holographic target system activated. The final challenge appeared in the space above the arena floor. It was a complex arrangement that rotated and moved, while wind generators created shifting air currents and holographic barriers appeared and disappeared at random intervals. The target zones were smaller than in previous rounds, and the distance had been extended to 75 feet. It was designed to push even the most skilled competitors to their absolute limits. Velshara took her position first as the defending champion. She stood perfectly still while her advanced eyes analyzed every aspect of the challenge. Meridians could see in spectrums that humans could not perceive, and could detect tiny variations in air pressure and density. Her first throw was a masterpiece of calculation and instinct combined. The dart curved around a holographic barrier and compensated for wind drift before striking a high-value zone. The crowd erupted in cheers. Her second throw was equally impressive as she hit a moving target at maximum distance. The third throw navigated through multiple obstacles to reach its destination. Her fourth throw seemed impossible, as it appeared to change direction mid-flight, but it was actually responding to wind currents that only Velshara could see. The fifth and final throw was perfect in every way, and struck the center of the highest value zone. The display showed Velshara's total score, 475 points out of a possible 500. It was one of the highest scores ever recorded in tournament history. The crowd gave her a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Commentators across the galactic broadcasts were saying that no one could possibly match that performance. The tournament was essentially over. Margaret stepped onto her platform and the arena fell silent again. She held her first dart and looked at the complex target arrangement. All the analysis and commentary and expectations faded away as she focused on the familiar weight in her hand. This was just throwing darts the same as she had done thousands of times before. The target was farther away and more complicated, but the fundamental motion remained unchanged. She thought about Jake teaching her to throw in that bar in Germany 30 years ago. She thought about her father teaching her to shoot on the ranch when she was a girl. She thought about all those Friday evenings in the barn working through her grief after Jake died, by finding peace in repetitive motion. She thought about her daughter Lisa back home, probably watching with half the town gathered around a television. Margaret drew her arm back and let her body do what it had learned through decades of practice. The first dart flew in a smooth arc that looked wrong to everyone watching. It appeared to be heading wide of the target. But Margaret had read the wind patterns and knew exactly what would happen. The crosswind caught the dart and guided it into a high-scoring zone. 95 points. The crowd made a collective sound of surprise. She had scored well on the most difficult challenge of the entire tournament. But she would need to maintain that level for 4 more throws to have any chance of matching Velshara. Margaret picked up her second dart and went through the same process. Watch the patterns and trust the motion. The dart navigated around a holographic barrier and struck a moving target. 95 more points. The arena was completely silent now except for the hum of the holographic generators. Every being present was focused entirely on the human woman standing on the platform. Margaret's third throw compensated for both wind and obstacles to hit another high-value zone. 95 points. She was maintaining perfect consistency. Commander Henderson was gripping the railing in front of his seat so hard his knuckles were white. Lieutenant Price had stopped taking notes and was simply watching with her mouth open. The entire human delegation was frozen in place, barely breathing. Back on Earth, billions of humans were experiencing the same tension as they watched their representative perform the impossible. Margaret's fourth throw seemed to hang in the air forever before striking home. Another 95 points. She was tied with Velshara with 1 throw remaining. The entire championship would be decided by a single dart. 1 throw would determine whether humanity's representative would win, or whether the defending champion would retain her title. Margaret stood on the platform holding her final dart, while the weight of billions of expectations pressed down from every direction. The arena was so quiet that she could hear the subtle hum of the holographic generators and the whisper of the artificial wind currents. This single throw would determine everything. 1 dart would either make her the galactic champion or the runner-up. The difference between victory and honorable defeat came down to this moment. She looked at the target configuration that hung in the air 75 feet away. The holographic system had generated the most difficult possible combination for this final throw. A small moving zone at maximum distance with multiple barriers creating a narrow corridor, and the wind generators running at full power. The mathematics involved in calculating a successful throw were staggering. Even with Velshara's advanced capabilities and centuries of meridian throwing tradition, that final perfect throw had been extraordinary. Margaret felt the dart in her hand. The same simple steel-tipped dart that she had owned for 3 decades. The grip was worn smooth from thousands of throws, and the flight was slightly bent from years of use. It was nothing special or expensive or technologically advanced, just a basic tool that she knew better than anything else in her life, because she had held it so many times that it felt like an extension of her own hand. She thought about why she played darts in the first place. It had never been about glory or recognition or proving anything to anyone. She and Jake had started throwing darts because it was something fun to do together on Friday nights, after a long week of farm work. After he died, she continued because those quiet evenings in the barn helped her process her grief and find some measure of peace. The repetitive motion was meditative, and the focus required pushed away all the other thoughts that would otherwise overwhelm her. Margaret realized in that moment that this throw was no different than any of the thousands she had made before. Yes, the stakes were higher, and yes, millions of beings were watching, and yes, this would determine a championship, but the actual physical act remained exactly the same. Draw back and sight the target and release at the right moment. Let the dart fly naturally without trying to force or control what happened after it left her hand. Trust the process that her body had learned through endless repetition. She drew her arm back and felt the familiar motion that had been refined through decades of practice. Her body knew the exact angle and the precise moment of release and the proper follow-through. Her mind was quiet and calm, as conscious thought stepped aside to let unconscious competence take over. This was what humans called flow state, or being in the zone, the moment when skill becomes automatic and everything else disappears. The dart left her hand in a smooth release that felt perfect the instant it happened. She did not need to see where it would land because her body already knew the throw had been true. The dart sailed through the artificial wind in an arc that looked wrong to everyone watching. It appeared to be heading too far left and too high, Several aliens in the crowd made sounds of disappointment, thinking the human had finally cracked under pressure. But Margaret had read the wind patterns correctly. The crosswind caught the dart exactly as she had anticipated based on years of reading Montana weather. The air current pushed it to the right while a downdraft brought it lower. The dart threaded through the narrow corridor created by holographic barriers that would have disqualified a miss by even a few inches. It curved slightly as it compensated for the shifting wind, and then straightened as it approached the moving target zone. The dart struck the very center of the highest value zone, just as it moved into position. 100 points. Perfect score. For exactly 3 seconds, the arena was completely silent. Then it erupted in noise that shook the walls and rattled the viewing platforms. Aliens from hundreds of species were screaming and cheering and making sounds of celebration in countless languages. The betting screens went wild as fortunes changed hands. News broadcasts across the galaxy interrupted regular programming to announce that the human had won. Margaret Sullivan had defeated the defending champion and become the new galactic champion. The official score appeared on the massive displays. Margaret 480 points. Velshara 475 points. The human had won by 5 points. The smallest possible margin, but a win nonetheless. The crowd continued to roar approval and the noise showed no signs of diminishing. Commander Henderson and Lieutenant Price were hugging each other and crying. The entire human delegation had exploded in celebration. On Earth, billions of humans were experiencing the same joy and excitement. Cities erupted in spontaneous celebrations as people poured into the streets. In Margaret's small town in Montana, the entire population gathered in the main square and someone set off fireworks even though it was mid-afternoon. At the bar where Margaret had played darts every Friday night, people were crying and hugging strangers and buying rounds for everyone. On the arena floor, Margaret stood quietly while chaos swirled around her. She felt relief more than anything else. The pressure was finally over and she could go home. Velshara approached and the crowd quieted to hear what the Meridian would say. Velshara bowed deeply in a gesture of profound respect. She said that Margaret had taught the galaxy an important lesson today, and that she was honored to have competed against such a skilled opponent. Margaret returned the bow and said that Velshara was a magnificent competitor, and that the match could have gone either way. She said that she had been fortunate and that 5 points was an incredibly slim margin. Velshara smiled and replied that fortune favored those who had prepared properly. She said that Margaret's decades of practice and dedication had earned this victory, and that there was nothing fortunate about skill developed through thousands of hours of work. The award ceremony was elaborate with dignitaries from hundreds of worlds in attendance. A stage had been constructed in the center of the arena, and Margaret stood in the spotlight while speeches were given in multiple languages. The Galactic Sports Commissioner presented her with the Champion's Medal, which was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that incorporated materials from worlds across known space. The medal was placed around her neck while cameras captured the moment from every possible angle. Margaret was asked to give a speech and she stepped up to the microphone feeling awkward and out of place. She was not comfortable with public speaking and did not know what to say to billions of beings listening across the galaxy. She kept it simple and spoke from the heart. She said that she was honored to be there and grateful for the opportunity to compete. She thanked everyone who had supported her, especially her daughter Lisa back home. She said that this medal belonged to every person who had ever spent time mastering something they loved. Not for glory, but because the work itself mattered. She said that skill was not about natural talent or technological enhancement or genetic advantages. Skill came from showing up day after day and doing the work even when no one was watching and no one cared. It came from thousands of small repetitions that built unconscious competence over years and decades. She said that anyone could achieve mastery if they were willing to dedicate the time and effort required. Her voice was gentle but carried conviction earned through 52 years of living. The crowd gave her a standing ovation that lasted for 10 minutes. Aliens who had mocked her at registration now stood and cheered with genuine admiration. Drakor the Undefeated was applauding with his massive hands. Thexnar the Vraxian was making gestures of respect. Even Zixthor, the crystalline official who had dismissed her so rudely, was displaying colors that indicated approval and acknowledgement of error. After the ceremony, Margaret was mobbed by reporters and spectators who wanted interviews or photographs, or simply to be near the champion. Security struggled to maintain control as the crowd pressed forward. Commander Henderson and Lieutenant Price fought their way through to extract Margaret, and escort her back to her quarters. The corridors were even more packed than before, and it took nearly an hour to travel a distance that should have taken 5 minutes. Back in her quarters, Margaret finally had a moment of peace. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the medal hanging around her neck. It was beautiful and meaningful, but also slightly uncomfortable. She was not used to wearing jewelry of any kind. She took it off carefully and set it on the table next to her worn dart case. Those two objects represented very different aspects of her life, but somehow they belonged together. She opened a communication channel to call home, and Lisa's face appeared on the screen. Her daughter was crying and laughing at the same time and could barely form coherent words. Behind Lisa, Margaret could see the kitchen of their farmhouse filled with neighbors and friends all celebrating. Someone was playing music and people were dancing. Lisa finally managed to say that she was so proud, and that the whole town had gone crazy, and that Margaret was a hero. Margaret smiled and asked again about the cattle. Lisa laughed through her tears and said that everything was fine at home. The pregnant cow had given birth to a healthy calf. The hay had been moved and the fences repaired. Frank and the neighbors had everything under control. The journey back to Earth took 3 days aboard a military transport ship that Commander Henderson had arranged. The ship was comfortable and much faster than the civilian transport that had brought Margaret to Chrono 7 for the tournament. She spent most of the trip resting in her quarters and trying to process everything that had happened. The peace and quiet were welcome after the overwhelming chaos of the championship and its aftermath. News of her victory had spread across human civilization faster than she could have imagined. Every major news network wanted interviews. Publishers offered enormous sums for book deals. Companies wanted her to endorse their products. Politicians wanted her to appear at rallies and events. The attention was exhausting, and Margaret turned down almost everything. She agreed to one official interview with a major network and a few brief appearances at government functions, but made it clear that she wanted to return to her normal life as quickly as possible. The ship arrived at Earth orbit on a clear morning, and a shuttle brought Margaret down to a military base in Montana not far from her home. The government had offered to arrange a massive public reception in Washington, but Margaret had politely declined. She said that she appreciated the thought but would prefer to just go home to her farm. After some negotiation, they agreed to a small ceremony at the base with local officials, and then she would be free to return to her regular life. The ceremony was mercifully brief. The governor gave a short speech and presented Margaret with a proclamation declaring her an honorary ambassador for Montana. The local mayor gave her a key to the town, even though the town was so small it did not have any locked municipal buildings. Margaret thanked everyone politely and said a few words about how honored she was to represent Earth. Then she climbed into her old pickup truck that Lisa had driven to the base, and they headed home. The drive back to the farm took them through familiar country roads that wound through valleys and past ranches. It was late summer, and the fields were golden with wheat ready for harvest. Mountains rose in the distance with snow still visible on the highest peaks. Margaret felt herself relaxing as the landscape became more familiar. This was her world, and these were her people. The galactic tournament already felt like it had happened to someone else in some other life. When they pulled into the driveway, Margaret saw that neighbors had hung a banner across the barn that read, "Welcome Home Champion," in hand-painted letters. Dozens of trucks and cars were parked in the yard, and she could see people gathered near the house. Someone had organized a welcome party, and it looked like half the county had shown up. Margaret sighed but smiled. She had known that her neighbors would want to celebrate, and it would have been rude to deny them that. The party lasted into the evening with people bringing food and drinks and telling stories. Old friends congratulated Margaret and asked questions about the tournament. Children wanted to see the medal and touch it for luck. Teenagers asked for advice about pursuing their own dreams. Margaret answered every question patiently and let everyone examine the medal, even though she would have preferred to put it away somewhere safe. Frank, the neighboring rancher who had helped Lisa with the farm work, pulled Margaret aside at one point. He was a man in his 60s who had known Margaret and Jake since they first bought the farm. He told her quietly that what she had done mattered more than she probably realized. He said that people needed to see that ordinary folks could accomplish extraordinary things. He said that in a world full of enhanced athletes and genetic modification and cybernetic implants, it was important to remember that dedication and practice still counted for something. Margaret thanked him and said she had just done her best. Frank shook his head and replied that she had done more than that. She had shown that humans belonged in the galaxy, not because of technology, but because of character. He said that every young person who watched her compete now understood that mastery came from within, and that external advantages were not required for greatness. Margaret had not thought about it in those terms, but she supposed he was right. As the sun set over the mountains, the party gradually wound down. Neighbors said their goodbyes and drove home down the long gravel driveway. Margaret and Lisa cleaned up the yard and put away the extra chairs that had been brought out. The farm grew quiet again, with only the normal sounds of cattle settling for the night and wind moving through the grass. Margaret stood on the porch and looked out at her land, feeling deeply grateful to be home. Over the following weeks, life slowly returned to normal. There were still occasional interview requests and appearance opportunities, but they became less frequent as new stories captured the media's attention. Margaret went back to her regular routine of feeding cattle and maintaining fences and all the endless small tasks required to run a farm. Lisa returned to college to finish her degree in agricultural science, and Margaret hired a part-time helper to assist with the heaviest work. Friday nights at the local bar resumed their familiar pattern. Margaret arrived around 7 in the evening and ordered a beer, and took her regular spot at the dartboard in the back corner. The other regulars were always happy to see her, and they played their usual games. Some tourists came specifically to see the famous champion throw, but Margaret treated them the same as everyone else. She would play a friendly game with anyone who asked politely, and never made a big deal about her accomplishments. The championship medal hung in the barn next to the old dartboard where Margaret had practiced for so many years. She had thought about displaying it somewhere more prominent, but the barn felt right. That was where the real work had been done. That was where she had spent countless evenings throwing darts and working through her grief and finding peace in repetitive motion. The medal was just the result, but the barn was where the actual journey had taken place. Scientists and sports analysts continued to study Margaret's technique for months after the tournament. They wrote papers about unconscious competence and muscle memory, and the human capacity for skill development through practice. Athletic programs incorporated her training philosophy. Coaches showed videos of her throws to young athletes and talked about the importance of fundamentals. Margaret found all of this attention slightly embarrassing, but understood that her story had become larger than herself. The galactic sports community also changed in unexpected ways. Several species began re-examining their reliance on enhancement technology and genetic modification. Training programs started emphasizing practice and dedication, rather than just physical advantages. A new category was created for unenhanced competitors, and participation grew rapidly. The tournament officials even renamed the championship trophy the Sullivan Cup in Margaret's honor, though she tried unsuccessfully to decline that recognition. Velshara, the former champion, visited Earth 6 months after the tournament. She came to Montana and spent a week at Margaret's farm, learning about human approaches to skill development. The two women became friends despite the barriers of language and species. They threw darts together in the barn and talked about technique and philosophy. Velshara said that losing to Margaret had been the best thing that ever happened to her because it taught her that there was always more to learn. Margaret's daughter Lisa graduated from college and returned to help run the farm. She had plans to modernize some operations and expand into organic certification. Margaret supported her completely and was glad that the farm would continue after she was gone. Lisa had learned the same lessons about dedication and patience that Margaret had learned from her own parents. The cycle continued as it always had. Years passed, and the galactic tournament became just one part of Margaret's life rather than defining it. She continued to compete occasionally, but never with the same intensity as that first championship. She won some matches and lost others and was content either way. The competition itself mattered less than the relationships formed and the lessons learned. She made friends with beings from dozens of species and learned that despite all the differences, the fundamentals remained the same across the galaxy. On Friday nights, Margaret still went to the local bar and threw darts with her neighbors. The routine never changed, and she liked it that way. Pick up a dart and throw, and pick up the next dart and throw again. The smooth repetition that brought peace and focus and clarity. She was older now, and her shoulder sometimes ached, but the motion remained fundamentally unchanged. Years of practice had built patterns in her nervous system that would last the rest of her life. Sometimes young people came to the farm asking for advice about achieving their dreams. Margaret always invited them in for coffee and listened to their stories. She told them the same thing every time. There was no secret or shortcut or trick. Mastery came from showing up consistently and doing the work even when no one was watching. It came from thousands of small repetitions over years and decades. It required patience and dedication and willingness to continue when progress seemed invisible. She told them that the galaxy had laughed at her when she first stepped onto that platform at Chrono 7. Aliens had mocked the simple farmer from Montana who carried cheap darts in a worn case. They had assumed that enhancement and technology would always defeat raw skill.